Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my channel and another little tutorial on the Empress Effects Zoia, the modular patchable synthesizer in a little box with the unique grid interface and where the only limitation is your imagination and the CPU, of course. Today it is also joined by the Korg K-oscillator, the original from, I think it is from 2007, if I don't remember incorrectly, which I've brought out because I want to use it to demonstrate how this patch works. Now, one of the things that I usually use when I play musical instruments, synthesizers, with my Zoia is that I use the MIDI fighter twister as my controller for controlling the Zoia in different ways. So that gives me a lot of continuous controllers, it gives me buttons, and it's very flexible and nice to use. But what if you want to not have to include an additional MIDI interface? What kind of possibilities does one have on the Zoia itself? And I think if you think about it, there are actually quite a few options for controlling things from the Zoia. Now, the limitation that is quite limiting, one might say, on the Zoia is that there is just one encoder. But there are different ways of getting around that. And one of the things that I have been trying to focus on every now and again in my tutorials is different ways of creating user interfaces on the Zoia. And this is one idea I had for how to control parameters that I normally would be controlling with something like the MIDI fighter twister. It will have some limitations, of course, but also it has some other nice features that the MIDI fighter twister or another MIDI controller would not have. So the way I've set this up now is I have 5 controllable parameters on this page here. If I wanted more than 5, I could have done additional pages. And the idea is that each parameter can be controlled in 8 discrete steps from off to full usually, and then steps in between that you can define yourself exactly what values you want them to be. That's one thing. Another thing I wanted to do was to make the transition between the different parameters when you change your setting to be smooth. If you want to, of course. If you have 8 steps of a parameter, very often that would cause the parameter to jump, and depending on what parameter it was, the effect would also be a kind of a skip. So what I have done also in this patch is that for each of these parameters, there is also a slew limiter that slows down the chain from one to another, from one setting to another. I'm just going to demonstrate that quickly now. So right now, just to tell you what I've got here, at the top I've got input volume. So minimum, that's off, maximum, that's full. Then I have delay time, minimum, that's minimum, and maximum is like that. That maximum is 2 seconds. Minimum is, I think, 67 milliseconds, which is, I could have made it 0, I suppose, by switching it off actually, but I made it the lowest setting now for simplicity's sake. The next one is also part of the delay, and that is the feedback amount. So that is full feedback, no feedback, and everything in between. The next one is reverb time. And also one thing I've done with this patch, as you can see, is when you set a setting here, the colors change. So not only does it show you just the pad that is active, although that might actually be clearer, because if you do like that, and you're not sure whether this was green off or green on, then yeah. But the lower setting, it will always show like this. So if it's a full line, then it will always be one color. That's just extra fun. You don't need to do it that way, of course. So that's a reverb time there. And then the last one is filter. That's a low pass filter frequency. And now it is fully open, as you can see. So I'm just going to start by putting all these settings now at the bottom, and let's see what happens. Well, we can't hear anything because there's no input volume. So let's increase the input volume. Still not much, and that is because the filter is closed. There we are. Filter fully open. Let's put on some delay. You can hear it change the delay time. Let's put on delay feedback. Let's put some reverb. Let's reduce the filter. Let's reduce the input volume now, increase the delay feedback, and I will just keep going. Right, and that's how it works. So I'm not going to be needing this anymore, really. So I'll just move this aside, and I'll be back in a second. Right, so now that I have shown you how it works, I'm going to show you how it's done. And it's quite a simple patching technique, really. I'll just go to this page, which I've used as an example now of how it is done. So we have here, this is the same at the top here. This is the same as one of those rows that you saw on the controller page. So we have 8 UI buttons. And when you push them, you can see that the one that you push and the ones to the left of it, they change color to indicate what the current setting is. And when you make this, all the UI buttons have to have outputs as well. So when you make a UI button, there is an option called CV output, and that should be set to enabled. So for each of these, CV output enabled. And in order for the UI buttons to control something, first of all, we need to find a way to register that we push one of these buttons. And the way we do this is by using a sample and hold. The way a sample and hold works is it has 3 pads. When the value at the input pad here, it can change over time, it can change just as you push the button, it doesn't matter. But when the middle button here, the trigger of the sample and hold, gets a trigger input, that means that it detects a rising value. So it does detect that rather quickly. I'm not sure how long it takes. Maybe it takes 1.3 milliseconds. I'm not sure. When it detects a rising value, it will copy the value that is exactly at that time at the input, and it will copy it over to the output pad. And the value will remain in the output pad regardless of what happens at the input until the next time it gets a trigger. That is, the next time it detects a rising value at the trigger input. So if the value goes up, it will not trigger again. If it goes down, it will not trigger again. But if it goes up again, then it will trigger. And as you can see, all these outputs from the UI buttons are now connected to the trigger of this sample and hold. So regardless of which of these buttons we push, the sample and hold will trigger. The input of the sample and hold, as you can see, is also connected to all these outputs here. But these are connected in a different way. When you have a UI button and you push it, the output will output a value of 1. So if you want that value of 1 to become something else later in our patch, then we need to change the connection strength. And so each of these have different connection strength. The first one here is 12.48. Next one is 24.91, and there's a pattern emerging, 37.32, etc. So roughly 12.5, just a bit less than 12.5, a little bit less than 25, a little bit less than 37.5, etc. And that is because these values are going to control a switch. So here we have an out switch. What an out switch does is it has a single input, it has a channel selector, then it has a certain number of outputs up to 16. And you choose how many you want when you make it. And the channel selection works that it takes the value of 1 and divides it by the number of channels. And so when you have 8 outputs, as we have here, and you take 1 divided by 8, you get 0.125. And that means that when the channel selector pad gets an input value from wherever that is between 0 and 0.125, it will select channel 1. If it gets a value between 0.125 and 0.25, it will select channel 2, etc., etc. So each of the channels have allocated to them 0.125 of the total possible input values that can be at the channel selector. So when the sample and hold here, as you can see, the sample and hold output is connected to the channel selector. When the sample and hold triggers, it will get sent the value from the same pad that is triggered. And because of the connection strength, that value will then be different values that will trigger the channels of the out switch. The first button will trigger the first channel, the second button triggers the second channel, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth, respectively. And so that is the way that you create a button interface with UI buttons generally, but of course in this one we're also specifically trying to do something else as well. So now each of these buttons then have to do something in the patch. So let's see, I'll just go into, well, there's two things that they are going to do now. One of the things they're going to do is to change the color of the UI buttons to show what is selected. And also they are going to change a parameter in something that you control in the patch. And of course, now that I'm mentioning this, there's absolutely no reason why this kind of user interface needs to control just the parameters of one module, or one parameter of one module in a patch. They can also control several things at the same time. They can control note values, they can control all kinds of things, absolutely anything really. Because all you got now so far is that you have the input value of the out switch, which I've set to 1, is then sent to one of 8 output channels. That's all that's happened so far. And then it's really up to you what those output channels are used for. But let's just say that first of all, we want to change the color of these buttons up here. Now, one thing that UI buttons, one of the things that I think makes them the superior button on the Zoia is that you can change the colors of them dynamically by using the value that is at the button. So the base color of this now is 0.1875 is the value that actually is set in these pads. And then when this activates, now it's channel 1 is active, and you see it's patched up to this UI button, and we look at the connection strength, it is 25%. So 0.1875 plus 0.25 is 0.4375. And if you wonder about these color codes, they are listed in the user manual in the module index. And the way you usually do it is you think of the value that you want it to have in its native state before it is affected by anything else. That's your starting value. And then when something changes that value, that's the value that you send to it. So I'll probably should do a tutorial just on that one day, just to go further into exactly how that works. But it is sending a value of 25% or a single strength of 25% to this button. If you activate channel 2 here, it sends a value of 25% to both buttons 1 and 2. And the third one sends to all 3 first buttons, etc. And that is how all the buttons to the left of the selected button is activated and shown with a different color as a visual feedback of what setting is active. Now, what about just to make it easy to adjust the base values, by the way, as you can see, I've got a value module down here. I'd almost forgotten about that. So this is the one that has the original value of these buttons. So none of these buttons now technically have an offset value in the module itself. They get their offset value by this value module here. So this value module sends a value of 0.1875 to all the buttons. And that way it's easy for me to change the color. So if I want to change it to red now, I will move this to 0.0. Oops, and my knob needs a little bit of contact spray. So if I go to 0.0375, that is maximum red. So that is going to be like so. And I go just as it switches off and 1 notch back, and I'm holding shift now for fine detail. And now the color is going to be green when you select it and red when it is unselected. So that is how that works. Now, in order for this to control something that we've seen in this patch, like a reverb, for instance, I'll just show you that now. I'll just remove or move out of the way this module there, and I'm going to add an effect module, just do a reverb light, see if I got room for that. Yeah, I got room for that. So I've got an audio input, decay time, mix, and output. So I'm just going to reduce decay time now to 0 in the module itself. Just get it to the bottom minimum value, like so. So now it is actually off. And now we want to use these buttons to control the reverb length of this module. So how do we do this? Well, one thing I also haven't said anything about yet is that you also need a slew limiter. So let's put it in a slew limiter here. So control module, well, you don't need a slew limiter, but if you want to smooth out the effect of the change of parameter, then you need a slew limiter. So I'm going to put a slew limiter in here. You don't need one, but you can if you want. So So now we want the output of the slew limiter, and of course if I wasn't using a slew limiter now, I would actually use a value module rather than patching directly into the reverb. But I'm using the slew limiter now as my value module, and this will patch into all of the outputs from these switches will now go into the slew limiter, and the slew limiter will go into the reverb time of the reverb. So now at the moment there is nothing going on in the reverb there. Nothing is patched into the slew limiter, and I'm going to patch the first step into the slew limiter now. And I'm going to make that a really, really low value. So I'm just going to scroll down now and just make that. It's a little bit more complicated, just a little bit, if you want to actually have a proper off stage, at least if you want it together with a slew limiter, because now the slew limiter, in order for that to create a slew also down to the minimum value, then the minimum value needs to actually be possible to get down here. Now you can use a comparator actually to make it happen that you get a completely off, but I'm not going to be bothered with that at the moment. So I'm going to show you that some other time perhaps. So now we've still got 0.00 seconds of reverb. Let's see, but we have, make sure we select number 1 here, and it says 0.00. At the moment, the reverb is now getting the input from the interface, but it is such a low value that it doesn't actually create any reverb time. Let's do a second, or maybe it's nice to define actually the lowest and the highest first. So I'm going to do the channel 8 now, and I'm just going to change the color of this as well because I can't distinguish it easily enough from this reverb here. So I'm going to do step 8 there and patch it into the slew limiter, and that's going to be 100% because I want step 8 to be maximum reverb. See, now it's going up because of the slew limiter up to infinite. So if I now push 1, it will go down slowly, and if I push 8 again, it will go up like so. So what about our step number 2, for instance? So I'm patching that in there, and I'm not sure exactly what I want this set to. So I'm just going to start out trying out a little bit. So I'm going to start by putting 10%. So let's see what it is now. We've got step 2. Let's select step 2 there, and then we see we get 0.62 seconds. So maybe I want a little bit less than that. So I'm going to make it a little bit less. 0.59. Maybe I want 0.5. I'm just going to keep adjusting sort of by eye like that until I get to 0.5. And then I'm going to select step 3, patch that in there, and maybe I'll go for 0.75 for this one. Let's see what we have here. That's too high. 0.69, getting closer. 0.77, 76, 75. There we are. So now we got 0, 0.5, 0.75. Let's do 1 second for the next one. And like so. Let's just select that one. 1.72, 1.53, 1.1, 1.02. 1 second. There we are. And you just continue like that. So you'd have to decide, of course, what parameters do you want, which parameters are useful to you to control from this control row here. Now, there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't also control other things from exactly the same parameters. Maybe you want your reverb to go up and your delay to go down at the same time. There's no reason why you can't do that. You just set the highest delay time to your lowest setting here, and vice versa, because you can patch these now into any parameter on any module with different connection strengths to control different things. And then of course you adjust the slew limiter by, or the slew rate by adjustment here. So, and of course you could use one of these control rows to change the slew rate as well, if you wanted to. Or you could actually patch the slew rate into the same controller as this as well. So there's no reason why you can't do it. So absolutely. So I think that's pretty much all I needed to show you now with this kind of patch. Of course, if you wonder, these now are spread out because I wanted to show you how these were patched up. But of course, when you use a user interface button, or you can do this with other modules as well, when you no longer need to patch anything into the output of a module, you can move things on top of an output, and like so, and you get a nice row of buttons, nice and tidy, and you can then create a nice and neat user interface with lots of color. If you want to create more than one row, you may notice now that all the modules you need to control this row here is on one page. And then you can take that one page and you can copy it to the next page, and it only preserves the connections within the page. It doesn't connect to the one you copied, so that now you have two different setups. So you can create all the setup you need for one row. You create your with a sample and hold, with your value or slew limiter module, with your switch, and then you can copy that page, and then you add whatever things you want to patch this switch to. Of course, you patch that up afterwards, so that you don't have to do all of this over and over again. You only have to patch up the switch, sample and hold, and the UI buttons one time. Right, so I think that's enough for today. And I hope you found this interesting, useful, or something that you may want to use in your patches. And if you do, then please let me know. It's always nice to hear when somebody has found some use for one of my tutorials. And thanks for watching, and goodbye for now. Bye bye.